Hello, ladies and gentlemen. In my lecture this week, I would like to cover a rare cryptid only truly known to exist on an island in the South Atlantic, not too far from Antarctica, and my experiences researching said creature. In 1992, I and my research partner, Alan, were fortunate enough to be allowed to explore an abandoned whaling station known as King's Port. We and a group of geologists hired a boat to take us across the South Atlantic for the trip. The university was kind enough to pick up the tab for the voyage, and some kind patrons helped as well. Between us and the geology department, we were able to pool our resources and make the excursion possible. So, as you can imagine, this wasn't exactly a luxury cruise. Kingsport was a whaling town. In the 1960s, economics took its toll on the town and things fell into disrepair. The short overview is that people were forced to seek employment elsewhere as funds dried up. In the winter of 1966, the town was set upon by a freak storm, forcing a hurried evacuation of the town. Given the sudden nature of the storm, only 2 boats were available to carry the remaining populace to safety. Space on board was at a premium, and certain sacrifices had to be made. No animals of any kind were allowed. So, any pets, work animals, or livestock were left behind. Unfortunately, it was discovered upon reaching their destination that another, greater sacrifice had been made. In their haste, 2 families were also left behind. After the storm, boats were sent back, but all that was found were the remains of the families. The crew reported that the remains were buried on the island as they had fallen prey to a pack of dogs, the discarded refugees of the past evacuation. The only ones unaccounted for were a pair of infant children, a girl from one family and a boy from the other. It was assumed, given the circumstances, that they were probably carried away by the dogs. Now, having set the grim background, let me tell you about the subject of our investigation. During the late 70s and early 80s, Kingsport became a bit of a tourist spot for people traveling the southern Atlantic region. Most people seem to have a fascination for abandoned places and things. The company that was conducting these tours began making a little money and established a little base in the actual town. It was staffed during the tourist season by 4 attendants. It was their jobs to inspect the remains of the town and keeping notes on the condition of the various buildings and as well conducting tours. They also had the task of keeping the feral dogs out of the town. This was a very difficult task as they had been breeding and had the run of the island since the late 60s. Fences had been erected around the town and, for the most part, they did the job. In 1984, a group of tourists came ashore and found the town abandoned completely. There was no sign of the 4 attendants. The base was searched. It was found to be in a state of disarray, but nothing was damaged. The only things of value that were missing were the attendants and their stores of meat. Obviously, the company sent people to investigate, and the bodies of the attendants were recovered. And, as you probably guessed, it was determined that the pack of dogs had been responsible. The company decided not to continue tours of Kingsport. They paid out some money in settlements and swept the whole thing under the proverbial rug. This is where my story begins. In the summer of 1986, I received a letter from a former employee of the company asking me if I would have a look at some of the materials she had compiled regarding the incident. I wrote back in the affirmative, and the package soon arrived. The package was filled with photocopied documents concerning the investigation into the incident on Kingsport. I didn't see anything in the documents that caused me to disagree with the findings of the company, but one thing of note was a journal page recovered from the base. It described an evening shortly before the disappearance. The author was having difficulties sleeping. The dogs had found a new way through the fence and were searching the area for food. The author described the scene as such. They are just outside. The sounds of their sniffing and digging are a constant drone in my ears. They scratch against the walls and dig under them. Normally, this isn't unusual, and I can put it far enough out of my mind to get to sleep. Tonight is different. There seems to be a method to their searching. Normally, they wander about randomly and eventually roam off. Tonight, they seem to be walking the walls systematically, searching one section and then moving on to the next patch. Most disturbing of all is the low guttural sounds they are making. One makes it, and then another responds with a sound of their own. As ridiculous as it seems, it is like they are communicating with one another. I would normally grab a flashlight and run them off, but that sound stays my hand. I contacted the lady and told her of my opinion on the matter. She said that she understands my views on the matter, but she directed my attention to a certain page. It was a description of the kitchen of the base. I looked it over and the accompanying photos. She directed my attention to a photo of the cold storage. The door hung open. I suggested to her that it's not unlikely that one of the attendants may have gone in it to get some meat to placate the dogs. She said if that were so, they would have used the key hanging by the door. The lock was broken off. I re-examined the photo. Her assessment was correct. The lock was broken, and next to it on the floor, there was a stone, roughly hand-sized. So, Alan and I find ourselves on Kingsport. We're armed with basic gear and a couple of odd notions. Our first night there, Alan entertained me with some wild speculation, as was his way. 2 missing infants were not killed, but perhaps taken in by the pack. By now, they would be nearly 20 years old. That would be a good enough explanation for the sounds and behavior reported in the journal. And while I agreed that there is a certain logic to that, I felt the majority of his reasoning was attributed more to the contents of his bottle than scientific reason. The geology team had decided to camp away from town, closer to their work site. Alan and I took up residence in the old base. Alan made sure that we had an area with locking door and where we could run a line from our small generator. We laid out our bedrolls and called it a night. During the evening, we were awakened by noises from outside the base. I strained my ears to hear what it was, but Alan, fueled by either paranoia or bourbon, claimed what we were hearing was what was described in the journal. I was incredulous, naturally, and started to say as much, but I suddenly heard it too, the low, guttural noises. And As described, there seemed to be multiple creatures engaging in a kind of primitive dialogue. I crept across the room, making my way to the window. In the moonlight, I could see several of the feral dogs roaming the yard around our generator. After a moment, I noticed something disturbing. Our power line had been pulled free of the generator. As I was processing this, something more disturbing met my eyes. The handle to the door was turning. I quickly pointed it out to Alan, who moved himself to the door to block it from opening. As if responding to the sound, whatever was trying the handle began violently shaking the door and screeching with an almost human voice. I craned my head to try and catch a glimpse of the thing at the door. As I did, something large moved past the window. I started and moved back from the glass. Grabbing a pair of cooking pots, I began clanging them together loudly in hopes of scaring the beasts away. I could see the dogs moving away from our camp reluctantly. They kept looking towards the door. Whatever was there was obviously to whom they deferred. Suddenly, the door stopped shaking. I bolted to the window to hopefully see the creature. And, to my horror, I did. Not one, but two. They were at least 5.5 feet in height and slender. They had powerful legs and very long strides. Their gait was a loping, bounding affair, and they had no trouble keeping pace with the pack. After a few minutes of silence, I cautiously ventured outside and reconnected our power line. We agreed it would be best if we radioed the ship. We had them send a launch to pick us up, and we'd spend the rest of the trip there, coming back in the daytime to gather evidence and cautiously explore. We radioed the geologists and told them to take precautions. We knew enough not to share our experience and instead informed them that the feral dog pack was intensely aggressive. The next day, we gathered tracks and hair samples. The analysis of these confirmed not my, but Alan's speculations. The tracks and hairs were a combination of dog and human.